They say death is the end, but for me, it was just the beginning. The beginning of a war fought in my own home, against my own blood. My husband's funeral was the opening shot, a volley of fake sympathy and saccharine lilies that choked the air. If you think you know what family betrayal looks like, I promise you, you have no idea. Stick with me, and I'll show you the truth buried under the floorboards of a perfect suburban life. Make sure to follow my story, like, and share it if you feel my anger, and comment below because I need to know I'm not alone. And don't forget to press that notification bell because you won't want to miss a single moment of how I burned it all down to get back what was mine. The air in our large Victorian home in Brookline, Massachusetts, was thick with the scent of lilies, a cloying funereal perfume that clung to the velvet curtains and seeped into the dark wood of the furniture. It was the scent of my husband Richard's death. He was finally blessedly gone. The year was 2025, and the world outside hummed with the electric whisper of self-driving cars and drone deliveries. But inside this house, time had stopped. It was a museum to a man I had known for 50 years, and a stranger I had slept next to every night. The sympathy from the neighbours was as thick and cloying as the smell of the flowers. They milled about the living room, balancing tiny plates of catered sandwiches, their faces arranged in masks of sorrow. He was a pillar of the community. One said, his hand on my shoulder. A great man. Another murmured, shaking his head. I just nodded my own face, a carefully constructed mask of the grieving widow. I had had a lifetime of practice at wearing masks. My son David was holding court by the fireplace. At 50, he still had the desperate air of a man trying to impress his father, even now that his father was a box of ashes on the mantelpiece. He wore a suit that was too expensive, the fabric straining slightly across his burgeoning midsection. He clapped men on the back, his voice a low, somber boom that he'd copied from Richard. "Dad would have appreciated all of you being here." He'd say, his eyes scanning the room, not for comfort, but for status. He was counting the important faces, tallying up his inheritance of respectability. Beside him, his wife Chloe was a portrait of subdued elegance. Her black dress was couture, her blonde hair pulled back in a chignon so severe it seemed to pull the skin tight across her cheekbones. She held a wine glass, her manicured fingers tapping rhythmically against the crystal. Every so often she'd dab a dry eye with a lace handkerchief, a perfect little performance for the assembled audience. I saw through it all. I saw the calculation in David's eyes, the impatience in the set of Chloe's jaw. They weren't grieving a man. They were closing a deal. I retreated to the bay window, watching the last of the mourners trail down the stone path to their expensive, quiet cars. The late autumn light was fading, casting long, skeletal shadows from the old oak trees across the lawn. This had been my view for half a century. I had watched David grow up on that lawn. I'd watched Richard stand there surveying his domain, a king in his castle. A castle he had built, yes, but one I had made a home. A prison I had learned to call home. The front door clicked shut. The silence that fell was heavier than the chatter that had filled it. It was a waiting silence. I turned from the window. They were standing there together, a united front. Chloe had already pulled out her phone, the screen casting a pale, ghoulish light on her face as she scrolled, her thumb moving with a predatory flick. "Mom," David began. He walked over and sat, not on the sofa next to me, but in Richard's armchair. The big one, the leather throne. It was a deliberate act, a claiming of the seat of power. The leather sighed under his weight, a sound I had heard a million times before. But from David, it sounded like a usurpation. "We need to talk." I just looked at him, my hands folded in my lap. "We are talking, David." He cleared his throat, unable to meet my gaze. He looked at the portrait of Richard above the mantel, as if for approval. "Chloe and I have been thinking. We've been worried about you." Chloe looked up from her phone, then her smile a thin, sharp line. It didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were like chips of ice. "This house, Elizabeth," she said, not even bothering with the pretense of calling me Mom. "It's far too much for you to manage on your own. The upkeep, the stairs. It's a huge burden." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I knew this tone. It was the tone Richard used when he was about to announce a decision that had already been made, a decision that would benefit him and diminish me. "I've managed it for 50 years. I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "I know its burdens." "Exactly." David jumped in, seizing on my words. "You've done your time. It's time for you to rest. Relax." That's what Dad would have wanted. He invoked his father's name like a holy scripture, a final, unarguable authority. "So we've decided. We're going to sell our place in the city. We're moving in." The words hung in the air, sucking the remaining warmth from the room. They weren't asking. They were informing me of my own eviction. My heart started a frantic, panicked drumming against my ribs. "Moving in here. It's the perfect solution," Chloe said, finally placing her phone face down on the polished mahogany side table. A gesture of finality. "We can take care of you. And the house. We'll take the master suite, of course. It has the best light. And we'll need the guest rooms for our offices." She paused, picking an imaginary piece of lint from her dress. "You can have the basement apartment. We looked at it this morning. It's quite cozy, really. Self-contained. Gives you your privacy. The basement. It wasn't an apartment. It wasn't anything. It was a damp, dark space where Richard stored his old tools and forgotten furniture, a place with a concrete floor and a single high window that looked out onto dirt and weeds. The proposition wasn't a suggestion. It was a verdict. They were sentencing me to the dungeons of my own castle. I looked from my son's face now, a mask of strained sincerity, to my daughter-in-law's, a picture of triumphant reptilian calm. In their eyes, I wasn't a mother or a grieving widow. I was an obstacle, a piece of old furniture to be moved out of the way. I had lived my entire adult life in the shadow of one tyrant, only to be handed over to two more. The house Richard built. My house. And I was being demoted to its cold, dark foundations. A ghost in my own life before I was even dead. They didn't waste a moment. The word fast doesn't begin to describe the surgical precision with which they dismantled my life. Before the last of the sympathy casseroles had been thrown out, the movers were there. They weren't the careful, respectful men who had moved our things in all those years ago. These were burly, indifferent men, hired by David men who worked by the hour and handled my possessions with the careless haste of garbage collectors. I stood by a silent sentinel of my own destruction as they packed my 50 years into cardboard boxes. The porcelain figurines my mother had given me were swaddled in newspaper and tossed into a box labelled Misc Knick-Knacks. My books, my companions, through decades of lonely nights, were swept from their shelves and piled like firewood. I reached out to touch the spine of an old, beloved novel, and one of the movers grunted, "Ma'am, please step back. You're in the way." I was in the way, in my own home. My world was reduced to boxes. Then the boxes were carried down a set of steep, rickety wooden stairs into the earth, down into the basement. Chloe had called it an apartment. That was a cruel joke. It was a tomb. A single cavernous room with a sweating concrete floor that was perpetually cold, even through the thin rug they'd thrown down. The walls were weeping with damp, and the air was thick with the primordial smell of mould earth and forgotten things. My new home. They had set up a metal-framed cot in one corner, the kind you see in army barracks or disaster shelters. Next to it was a small table with a hot plate and a kettle. In the opposite corner, shrouded in shadow, was the final, deepest humiliation, a portable chemical toilet. Its plastic form gleamed under the light of the single naked bulb that hung from a wire in the center of the room. My throne. My only connection to the world above was a single grime-covered window, a small rectangle set high in the wall at ground level. Through it, I could see nothing but a slice of the muddy flower bed and the occasional scuttling legs of a spider. It was a view of the dirt, a grave's eye view. That first night, the cold was a living thing. It seeped up from the concrete through the thin mattress of the cot and into my bones. It was a damp, relentless chill that no blanket could warm. Above me, my life was being erased and rewritten. I could hear their footsteps on the hardwood floors, my floors, a constant hollow, drumming overhead. I could hear them laughing. It was a full-throated, joyous sound that echoed down into my crypt. They were celebrating. Then came the sounds of redecoration, the grating screech of my favorite armchair being dragged across the floor, the rhythmic, violent thud of a hammer driving nails into my walls, hanging their art, their mirrors, their lives over the faint outlines of mine. Each hammer blow felt like a nail in my own coffin. I lay there, shivering a prisoner in the foundation of my own house. I closed my eyes and tried to block it out, but the sounds were relentless. Sometime after midnight, my old cheap tablet, the one they deigned to let me keep, pinged. I fumbled for it, the screen's harsh light blinding me in the darkness. It was a notification from Instagram. Chloe had tagged me in a post. My fingers trembled as I opened the app. There it was, a professionally lit, beautifully filtered photograph of David and Chloe standing in the living room upstairs. They were smiling arms around each other. The room behind them was already different. My photos were gone from the mantelpiece, replaced by a minimalist silver sculpture. The caption read, "Making a fresh start in this beautiful family home. So much history here. We're going to pour all our love into renovating it and preserving Dad's incredible memory." It's what he would have wanted. Feeling so blessed. And then the hashtags like Little Daggers, Family First, New Beginnings, Legacy, Brookline Home, Making Memories. The hypocrisy was so profound, it was a physical sickness. I felt bile rise in my throat. I could see the comments flooding in beneath the picture. "So sorry for your loss, you guys are so strong. What a beautiful tribute to your father. You're such a wonderful son, David." They were curating their own narrative, painting themselves as devoted children, taking on a noble burden. And I was the secret in the cellar, the inconvenient truth they had swept under the rug. Literally. I switched off the tablet and plunged myself back into darkness. Lying on that cold cot, I listened to the house settle around me. The groans of the old wood, the sigh of the pipes. This house had always had its secrets. Richard's secrets. He was a man made of them, held together by control and silence. For 50 years I had lived on the surface, deliberately averting my eyes, not wanting to know what lay beneath the polished facade of our perfect life. I had chosen ignorance because the truth was too terrifying to contemplate. But now, I was no longer on the surface. I was down in the dark, in the guts of the house where things were buried. And for the first time, I could feel the weight of those secrets pressing down from above, a palpable, crushing force. I didn't dare to look before. But now I was already in the grave. What else was there to be afraid of? The days that followed bled into one another, a grey, monotonous smear of humiliation. My life was governed by the sounds from upstairs. The rumble of the coffee machine in the morning, a ritual I was no longer a part of. The cheerful chime of the doorbell announcing their friends, their caterers, their interior designers. My existence was reduced to a routine of quiet subservience. Each week, David would descend the wooden stairs, his face a mask of performative concern. He wouldn't step all the way into the room, but would stand on the bottom step, as if afraid to be contaminated by my poverty. He'd hand me a small wad of cash, $50. "Here you go, Mum," he'd say, his voice resonating with false charity. "Make it last. Let us know if you need anything reasonable." It was my own pension money, the money I had earned during my years as a librarian before Richard decided it was unseemly for his wife to work. Now it was being doled out to me like an allowance for a troublesome child. My access to the kitchen was a battleground of passive aggression. The first time I went upstairs to make a proper meal, I found Chloe standing there, arms crossed. "Oh," she'd said, her voice dripping with manufactured surprise. "I was just about to have a new lock installed on the pantry. For the caterers, you know. We can't have things going missing." The message was clear. I was a potential thief in my own kitchen. After that, they would leave a small tray of food for me at the top of the basement stairs. A sandwich with the crusts cut off, a small container of yogurt, a flask of lukewarm soup. It was the kind of meal you'd give to a shut-in, an invalid. They were systematically stripping me of my autonomy, my dignity, my very identity as the matriarch of this house. They spoke to me in that slow, loud voice people reserve for the very old or the mentally infirm, as if my demotion in living space had been accompanied by a demotion in intellect. A storm raged inside me, a constant churning conflict. One part of me, the part that had been carefully cultivated and conditioned by Richard for 5 decades, whispered that I deserved this. Richard was a pillar of the community, a man who donated generously to charities and sat on the boards of hospitals. He was charming and powerful and respected. But behind the closed doors of our perfect Victorian house, he was a different man. He was a tyrant of the soul. His abuse wasn't physical. It was far more insidious. It was in the constant, subtle chipping away at my confidence. The way he would dismiss my opinions at dinner parties with a condescending chuckle, saying, "Oh, Elizabeth, what do you know of such things?" It was in his absolute control of our finances, giving me a household budget I had to account for down to the last penny, while he spent lavishly on himself. It was in the way he isolated me from my friends, subtly criticizing them, until I simply stopped inviting them over. I wasn't his partner. I was his prettiest, most valuable possession. An object to be displayed, maintained, and controlled. He had trained me to be small, to be silent, to be grateful for the gilded cage he had built. And so a part of me accepted my children's cruelty as a continuation of my sentence. I was his possession, and now I was theirs. But another part of me, a tiny, stubborn flame that had somehow survived 50 years of being doused, was angry. It was a cold, hard fury that began to solidify in my chest. It was the anger of a caged animal that has finally realized the door was never truly locked. This wasn't justice. This was a coup. This was theft. And this anger, this tiny, flickering flame, was fed by memory. One night, I was startled awake by a loud noise from a construction site down the street, the low, grinding roar of a cement mixer. The sound, so mundane, acted as a key, unlocking a memory I hadn't revisited in years. It came back not as a gentle recollection, but as a vivid, full-sensory flashback. I was suddenly standing on the muddy patch of land that would become our front lawn. The year was 1975. The skeleton of the house was rising behind me, and a team of construction workers was gathered around the gaping rectangle that was the foundation. They were preparing for the final, most crucial pour of concrete. And I saw Richard. He wasn't the calm, in-control man I knew. He was frantic. His tailored suit jacket was off-thrown over a pile of lumber. His tie was loosened, and his face, normally ruddy with confidence, was pale and slick with sweat, despite the cool autumn air. He was pacing back and forth along the edge of the pit, shouting at the workers. His voice was sharp, high-pitched, laced with an unnerving panic. He wasn't yelling about the quality of their work or the pace. He was obsessed with one particular section of the foundation, a deep cavity right in the center, directly under the spot where his grand marble fireplace would one day stand. "Careful there, careful!" he had shrieked as a worker maneuvered a wheelbarrow of wet cement. "Just pour it. Get it done." I remembered being confused. He was usually so meticulous, so obsessed with perfection. But on that day, he seemed desperate only for speed, for the simple act of filling the hole, of covering something up. At one point, a young worker stumbled near that central cavity, his boot slipping on the wet clay. Richard lunged forward and grabbed the man's arm with a strength that was terrifying. He hauled him back, his eyes wide with a wild primal fear. It wasn't the look of a proud homeowner overseeing his creation. It was the look of a man burying a terrible secret, terrified it might be discovered before the earth could seal it forever. The memory faded, leaving me trembling in the cold darkness of the basement. The grinding of the distant cement mixer fell silent, but the image of Richard's face, contorted in raw panic, was burned onto the back of my eyelids. For years I had dismissed it as the stress of a massive project. But now, from my vantage point beneath the house, the memory was different. It was recontextualized. It was no longer just a memory. It was a key to understanding the man I had married and the house he had built. His frantic energy, his paranoid supervision of that one spot, his overwhelming relief when the concrete finally flooded the cavity and hardened into an impenetrable grey slab. It wasn't pride I had seen on his face that day. It was the desperate relief of a man who had just successfully hidden a body, and a chilling, absolute certainty settled over me. Richard wasn't building a home. He was building a tomb. My days settled into a new rhythm, marked not by the sun, but by the hum of the boiler and the shifting shadows cast by the single high window. Chloe and David had granted me one thing in their cruelty: solitude. Endless, echoing solitude. It was in this quiet that the house began to speak to me, not in words, but in whispers of cold draughts and settled dust. My world was now these 4 concrete walls, this floor, this low ceiling, where the pipes snaked like metallic veins. I began to explore it, not out of boredom, but out of a strange, primal need to understand my prison. I ran my hands along the walls, feeling the rough, cold texture of the poured concrete. I traced the lines where the forms had been joined, the ghost of the house's creation. Behind a leaning stack of old paint cans, their labels faded and peeling, something caught my eye. It was a patch, a section of the concrete wall, maybe 3 feet square, that was a slightly different colour, a smoother, less weathered grey. The finish was clumsy, amateurish. It was wrong. It didn't belong. The memory of Richard, his face tight with an unnatural anxiety as he watched the foundation being poured, flashed through my mind. He had hovered over the workmen right here, in this very corner, his hands clasped behind his back, a general surveying a secret battlefield. "Make sure it's perfect." He'd snapped at the foreman, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. At the time, I'd dismissed it as his usual obsessive perfectionism. Now, standing in the cold, damp air, that memory felt like a key turning in a long, rusted lock. I found an old garden trowel in a rotted wooden crate, its handle splintered and its metal tip bent. It was a pathetic tool, but it was all I had. I knelt on the cold floor, the chill seeping through my thin trousers, and I began to chip away at the edges of the patch. The sound was small at first, a pathetic tink, 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 that seemed to be swallowed by the vastness of the basement. My arms, unaccustomed to such labour, began to ache. Sweat beaded on my forehead, mingling with the ever-present dampness. Hours bled into one another. The world upstairs, the sound of Chloe's laughter, The drone of the television David watched faded into a distant, irrelevant noise. All that existed was the wall, the trowel, and the burning in my shoulders. Finally, a larger piece of the patched concrete broke away, falling to the floor with a dusty thud. Behind it was not more concrete, but darkness, a void. My heart hammered against my ribs. I worked with a new, frantic energy, prying and scraping my knuckles raw and bleeding until the opening was large enough to reach into. My trembling fingers met something hard, cold, and metallic. It was heavy. Grunting with the effort, I pulled it out. It was a box, small enough to be held in 2 hands, but dense, unnervingly heavy for its size. The surface was a dull, dark grey. Lead. It was a lead-lined box. A part of me, the part that had survived Richard for 50 years, screamed at me to stop, to put it back, seal the wall, and forget. This was a secret he had literally cemented into the foundations of our lives. Opening it was a transgression he would never have tolerated. But Richard was dead, and I was a prisoner in his tomb. My hands shook so violently I could barely work the simple clasp. It finally gave way with a soft click. I lifted the lid. There was no diary, no hidden financial documents, no confession. It was worse, so much worse. Resting on a bed of what looked like faded red velvet was a collection, a hoard. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. A thick lock of blonde hair tied with a simple blue ribbon. A child's locket, sterling silver, tarnished with age, shaped like a heart. A single pearl earring, the kind a young woman might wear on a first date. My fingers numb with cold, and shock picked it up. It was real. And then I saw the Polaroids. They were tucked underneath the velvet lining. A stack of them, maybe half a dozen. The chemical scent of old film hit me as I lifted them out. The first picture was of a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, with the same blonde hair as the lock in the box. She was in a car, her face a mask of pure terror, her eyes wide and pleading with the person holding the camera. Her mouth was open in a scream the picture had silenced forever. I dropped it, as if it had burned me. I forced myself to look at the others. A different girl, her face streaked with tears, clutching a torn blouse. Another younger, whose face was obscured by shadow, but whose fear was a palpable thing, a presence in the stale basement air. They weren't pictures of an affair. This wasn't the work of a man who cheated. This was monstrous. Richard, my husband, the man who had demanded my subservience, who had belittled me into a shadow of myself, was not just a bully. He was a predator. And these were his trophies. The walls of the basement seemed to press in on me, the cold air, thick with the silent screams of these forgotten girls. The foundation of my house, the foundation of my entire life, was built on a graveyard. In the days that followed, the box became a malevolent presence in my small room. I hid it inside an old suitcase, but I could feel its weight, its density, a tiny black hole of horror. I could barely eat the meager toast and tea I was allowed. Sleep offered no escape. The terrified faces from the Polaroids haunted my dreams. The true nature of my marriage, of the man I had shared a bed with for half a century, had been revealed, and it was a truth so vile it threatened to shatter what little was left of me. My only point of contact with the world, the only spark of warmth in the deepening cold, was Leo, my grandson. He was 17, a lanky, quiet boy, with his mother's sharp features, but none of her brittle vanity. He had my eyes, a detail Chloe always seemed to resent. He would come down once or twice a week, a furtive visitor bearing gifts of contraband, a bag of chips, a chocolate bar, a can of soda. He'd sit on the edge of my cot, pretending his visit was casual. "Gram, you doing okay down here?" He'd ask, his voice, always a little too quiet, his eyes scanning the grim little room. He never looked at me directly when he asked, as if he were afraid of the answer. I'm fine, dear. I'd lie forcing a smile that felt like cracking porcelain. It's quiet, gives an old woman time to think. But he wasn't fooled. I could see the worry etched around his eyes, the clench in his jaw. He saw the thin blanket, the plate with its leftover crusts, the dampness that clung to everything. He hated what his parents were doing. It was in the way he'd look up at the ceiling when he heard his mother's sharp laughter, a flicker of disgust crossing his young face. One evening he brought me a small meatball sub, wrapped in waxy paper. The smell of the warm bread and savory sauce filled my cell, a scent of a life I no longer lived. We sat in silence for a while, as I ate the simple act of sharing food, forging a bond stronger than any words. He watched me, his expression unreadable. I looked at him, this boy on the cusp of manhood, with a conscience still intact, a soul not yet corrupted by the greed that consumed his parents. And I made a decision. It was a tremendous risk. If I was wrong, if he told them, it would be the final nail in my coffin. They would have all the proof they needed that I was paranoid, delusional, losing my mind. But looking at his earnest, worried face, I knew I had to trust him. He was my only hope. I finished the last bite of the sandwich and carefully folded the paper. I took a deep breath. Leo, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen. Really listen, without asking too many questions right now. Can you do that for me? He nodded, his full attention on me now. The casual pretense was gone. Of course, Graham. Anything. I chose my words with surgical precision. I couldn't show him the box. I couldn't scar his mind with those images. The horror of it was mine to bear. Your grandfather. He wasn't the man everyone thought he was. He wasn't just a difficult man. He was a bad man. A very bad man. I found something down here. Something he hid a long time ago. It proves it. I paused, letting that sink in. And your parents? They're not just trying to move in, Leo. They are trying to take everything. The house, the money, all of it. They plan to put me away. His face hardened. I know, he said, his voice a low growl. I hear them. They talk about it when they think I'm not listening. Power of attorney. Incompetent. They think you're losing it. The confirmation sent a chill through me, but it was validating. I wasn't just being paranoid. They're going to succeed, Leo. Unless I have help. I can't do this alone. I need your help. He looked at me, his young face suddenly looking years older, weighted with a premature gravity. He didn't hesitate. There was no flicker of doubt, no fear. Just a quiet, burning anger on my behalf. What do you need me to do? Relief washed over me so powerfully I felt lightheaded. You're good with those. Those computers, aren't you? All that technology. A small wry smile touched his lips for the first time. Yeah, Graham. You could say that. Leo was more than good. He was a whiz, a native of a digital world I only dimly understood. He lived online building computers and navigating networks with an ease I found both baffling and miraculous. I need proof, Leo, of what your parents are planning, conversations, anything they say about their plans for me, for my money. It needs to be recorded. It needs to be undeniable. He nodded slowly, his mind already working. I can do that. I can set up a voice-activated recorder on my phone. Leave it in the living room or the kitchen when they're talking. They'll never know. I can upload the files to a secure cloud server somewhere they can't find them. He spoke the language of espionage as if it were second nature. He was my spy, my secret weapon. There's one more thing, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. I need a way to get online. A way to look things up without them knowing. A tablet, he said instantly. A burner. I can buy one with my own money. I'll set it up with a VPN so everything you do is anonymous, untraceable. I'll bring it to you tomorrow. He stood up. The meeting concluded. He gave my hand a quick, firm squeeze. "We're going to fight them, Graham," he said, a promise in his eyes. As he slipped out of the basement, closing the door softly behind him, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt since Richard's funeral: hope. It was a fragile, terrified thing, but it was there. I was no longer just a victim waiting for the end. I was a conspirator. The next evening, Leo returned as promised. He carried a laundry basket, a prop for his visit. Tucked between his own dirty clothes was a slim black tablet and a charging cord. He showed me how to use it, his long fingers flying across the screen. He'd already set everything up: the incognito browsers, the VPN, he explained, was a tunnel that hid my location, a secure email address under a false name. "Her name is Helen Martin," he said, with a grim smile. "She's a retired librarian from Ohio," my new identity. He also handed me a tiny digital audio recorder no bigger than my thumb. "This is better than the phone. The battery lasts for days. Just click this button to start and stop. Leave it under the sofa cushions." He was my lifeline. He was my general. That night, after the house above me had fallen silent, I turned on the tablet. The sudden glow of the screen in the oppressive darkness felt like lighting a candle in a tomb. My fingers, stiff and clumsy, typed my first search into the glowing bar. I started with the time the house was built, 1975. Missing persons, Brookline, Massachusetts, 1975. The search results began to load a list of digital ghosts. My blood ran cold. I clicked on the first link, a digitized newspaper archive from the Boston Globe. "Local teenager vanishes on walk home." The article was dated October 1975. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. She was 16. There was a grainy black and white school picture of a smiling girl with bright eyes and long blonde hair. The same hair as the lock in the box. The article said she was last seen wearing a blue ribbon. My breath hitched in my chest. I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just a trophy. It was a part of her. A part Richard had stolen. I forced myself to keep searching. I cross-referenced the items. Silver locket missing girl, 1970s. This search was harder, the details more obscure, but I found it buried in a forum for cold cases. A post from a user claiming to be the niece of a woman named Maria Flores. Maria was a waitress at a diner a few towns over. She disappeared in the summer of 1978 after her shift. The post mentioned her most prized possession, a silver heart-shaped locket her mother had given her. It was never found. The pearl earring was the most generic, the hardest to trace. But I searched for missing women in the area between 1975 and 1980, and the list was terrifyingly long. 3 women. 5. 10. Each name was a life cut short, a family shattered. Any one of them could have been the owner of that earring, a final, terrified adornment. The faces from the Polaroids swam before my eyes. They weren't just random victims anymore. They had names: Sarah, Maria. They had lives, hopes, families who had waited for them to come home. Richard hadn't just abused me. He had collected souls. My investigation needed a new direction. It wasn't enough to know who. I needed to know where. The memory of the foundation of the lead-lined box sparked a new, terrible thought. The box was small. A body was not. But what if the box was just an appetizer? What if the main course was still buried? I searched for the architectural firm that had designed the house. Thompson and Sons, Architectural Design. The father, Arthur Thompson, the lead architect on my house, was long dead. But his son Robert now ran the firm. I found his email address on their sleek, modern website. My hands trembled as I composed the message, choosing my words as carefully as I had with Leo. I was Helen Martin, the retired librarian from Ohio. No better. I was a student. Younger, less suspicious. To R. Thompson, thompsonarchitects.com. Subject Research Inquiry, Historical Brookline Residential Architecture. Dear Mr. Thompson. My name is Jessica Adler. I am a graduate student at Boston University pursuing a master's in architectural history. My thesis focuses on mid-century residential design in the greater Boston area, specifically the custom modifications requested by clients in the 1970s. Your firm's work, particularly the residence at 24 Hemlock Lane, built in 1975, has come to my attention as a key example. I am hoping you might still have the original unrevised blueprints for that project in your archives. I am particularly interested in the foundation plans and any client-mandated addendums or structural notes that may have been made during construction. Any assistance you could provide would be invaluable to my research. Thank you for your time and consideration. Sincerely, Jessica Adler, BU Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. I hit send. The email disappeared into the digital ether. Now all I could do was wait and listen. My new routine of research and waiting was shattered a few days later. I heard the front door open and close, followed by the heavy, confident footsteps of a man I didn't recognize, accompanying the lighter, more hesitant steps of David. Chloe's voice was syrupy sweet. He's right this way. She just likes her privacy. A moment later, the basement door swung open, flooding my dark world with harsh light from the hallway. David stood there, his face a mask of strained concern. Beside him was a man in a perfectly tailored grey suit that probably cost more than my entire monthly budget. He had sleek, dark hair, a predatory smile, and held a slim leather briefcase. He was a shark. This was the escalation, Mother David said, his voice laced with false gentleness. This is Mr. Davies. He's our family attorney. He just wants to have a little chat. They didn't invite me upstairs. They descended into my territory. The lawyer Davies surveyed my grim surroundings with a look of theatrical pity, his eyes lingering on the single cot and the bare concrete walls. David hovered by the stairs, unable to meet my gaze. Chloe remained at the top, a silent, smug overseer. Mrs. Albright Davies began, his voice smooth as silk and just as suffocating. He didn't sit instead, choosing to stand over me, asserting his dominance. I'm here to help resolve this delicate family situation. David and Chloe are deeply concerned for your well-being. He gestured vaguely at the room. This is no place for a woman of your age. They want what's best for you. I remained silent, my hands folded in my lap, my face a carefully constructed blank slate. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing my fear. So we have a proposal. He continued, snapping open his briefcase. A very generous one. In exchange for you relinquishing all claims to this property and signing over power of attorney to David, he is prepared to offer you a settlement. A lump sum that will ensure you are taken care of comfortably for the rest of your days. Taken care of where I asked, my voice a dry rasp. We've found a very reputable state-run nursing facility, he said, not missing a beat. Quiet, secure, with round-the-clock medical staff to see to your needs. A state-run home. A different kind of prison, but a prison nonetheless, where I would be sedated, managed, and forgotten. I could feel the ice in my veins. And if I refuse, Davies's smile tightened. The silk was gone, revealing the steel beneath. Then I'm afraid we'll have to take a different route. We will petition the court to have you declared mentally incompetent. We have ample evidence. Your self-imposed seclusion in this basement. Your refusal to engage with your family. Your paranoia. He let the word hang in the air. Frankly, Elizabeth, a judge will take one look at your living conditions, listen to your son's heartfelt testimony of your decline, and they will not hesitate to grant his request. You will lose everything, and you will end up in the same facility, only without the generous settlement. This is your one chance to walk away with a shred of dignity and some financial security. It was a perfectly constructed trap. My word against theirs. My age, my gender, my grief, all weaponized against me. They would paint me as a confused, hysterical old woman driven mad by loss, and the world, the legal system, would believe them. For the first time, a wave of profound, soul-crushing despair washed over me. The fear that Richard had so expertly cultivated in me for 50 years, the fear of being powerless, of being disbelieved, of being alone, surfaced with a vengeance. It wrapped its cold hands around my throat. What was I even doing? Playing detective in a basement, fighting a battle against my own son, against lawyers in expensive suits. This would ruin the family name, the name I still bore. It would drag Leo, my sweet, brave Leo, into an ugly public spectacle. Maybe this was the price of Richard's sins, a price I was now being forced to pay. Maybe I should just take their deal, sign the papers, disappear into the quiet oblivion of a nursing home, and let the secrets of this house die with me. The fight drained out of me, replaced by a vast, empty weariness. Guilt gnawed at me. Guilt for a lifetime of silence, guilt for even considering this fight. I was just an old woman. What chance did I have? After they left, closing the door and plunging me back into darkness, I sat on my cot for a long, long time. The lawyer's words echoed in the small space. Incompetent. Paranoia. No chance. I pulled the thin blanket around my shoulders, but the chill was deep in my bones. I was tired. So profoundly tired. I reached for the tablet, my finger hovering over the icon for the email. I would write to the architect's son. Tell him I'd made a mistake, that I no longer needed the plans. I would erase my fake identity. I would call David. I would agree to their terms. It was over. I had lost. Just as my finger was about to tap the screen, a soft chime sounded from the tablet. A notification. A new email had arrived. My heart gave a painful lurch. It was from Robert Thompson. Subject: Research Inquiry. Historical Brookline Residential Architecture. Dear Ms. Adler. What a fascinating project. My father was always very proud of his custom work. Finding plans from that era took some digging in our physical archives, but I believe I have what you're looking for. I've scanned the original foundation blueprint from 1975 for 24 Hemlock Lane. Please find the PDF attached. Good luck with your thesis. Best, Robert Thompson. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from a surge of adrenaline. I downloaded the file. A blue and white image filled the screen, a web of lines, numbers, and architectural notations. It was overwhelming. I almost dismissed it, my hope already extinguished. But I forced myself to look closer, my eyes scanning the intricate drawings, tracing the dimensions of the basement where I now sat. And then I saw it. It was an anomaly, a section of the foundation that didn't make sense. It was right under the main living room, directly beneath the massive stone fireplace, a rectangular void clearly outlined. And beside it, a small typed note from the original architect, Arthur Thompson, a ghost speaking to me from 50 years in the past. Client-mandated void, approx. 6x46. Not part of original design. Added at client's request and expense post-initial pour. Per client instruction chamber is to be reinforced with steel rebar and fully lead-lined. Client stressed extreme secrecy regarding this modification. Structural integrity approved, but purpose unknown. A 6 by 4 foot lead-lined hollow chamber. A tomb. He hadn't just buried trophies in a small box. He had buried a body. Right under the hearth, the symbolic heart of the home he had built a secret crypt. The silver locket. The missing waitress, Maria Flores. Her body was down there, buried in the very bones of my prison. The despair that had crippled me moments before evaporated, burned away by a sudden blinding clarity. It was replaced by something new, something hard and cold and absolute, a resolve of pure ice. I was not fighting for a house anymore. I was not fighting for my pride or my money. I was fighting for Sarah, for Maria, for the terrified girls in the Polaroids. I was fighting for a forgotten soul buried beneath my feet. This was not about my survival now. This was about justice. And I would tear this house to the ground to get it. The blueprint wasn't just paper and ink. It was a map to the heart of a monster, and it was the key to my own liberation. The despair that had clung to me like damp cellar air for weeks evaporated, replaced by something cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear. A purpose. The legal threat from David and Chloe, the condescending pressure from their lawyer, it all became irrelevant noise. They were playing checkers. I was about to overturn the entire board. I picked up the burner phone Leo had given me. My hands were perfectly steady. I dialed the number for David's lawyer, a man named Peterson, whose voice oozed a kind of predatory sympathy. He answered on the second ring, his tone professionally smooth. "Elizabeth, I'm glad you called. I trust you've had time to consider our very generous offer." I let a quaver enter my voice, a performance I had been rehearsing in the dark. Yes. Yes, I have." I paused, letting him savor his presumed victory. I'll agree." I could almost hear the smile spreading across his face. "An excellent decision. Wise. It's for the best, truly. We can have the paperwork drawn up immediately. But I have conditions." I said, my voice small but firm, the voice of a woman making a last sentimental request, a flicker of annoyance in his tone. "Conditions. Elizabeth, the offer is more than fair. They are not negotiable," I said, and the firmness was a little less feigned this time. "First, I want one final month in the house. Just one. For sentimental reasons. To say goodbye to my home, to my memories." I heard him sigh, a sound of patronizing impatience. He was already calculating his fee. "What was one more month? And the second condition? I need a portion of the settlement paid out in advance, directly to me. A wire transfer. I have personal expenses to take care of, things I need to settle before I move on." I let my voice trail off, suggesting the finality of a nursing home. There was a long silence on his end. He was thinking it over. The greed of his clients would be his undoing. They wanted this done. They wanted the house, the money, the win. A small early payout to secure the entire estate was a minor inconvenience. "How much of an advance are we talking about?" he asked, his voice cautious. I named a figure. It was substantial enough to be meaningful, but small enough in the grand scheme of the estate to seem plausible for personal expenses. It was, however, more than enough for what I had planned. "I'll have to discuss this with David and Chloe," he said stiffly. "But I think we can make that work. I'll be in touch once the funds are ready to be transferred." He hung up, and I stared at the phone. The first cog in the machine had turned. Later that day, David called. His voice was laced with a triumphant, magnanimous tone that turned my stomach. "Mother Peterson told me you've seen reason. I'm glad. This is for the best. We'll make sure you're comfortable. And this final month, take your time. Say your goodbyes." "Thank you, David," I whispered. "That's very kind of you." He didn't detect the ice beneath the words. He only heard what he wanted to hear: surrender. 2 days later, the money appeared in the new bank account Leo had helped me set up. Seeing the number on the screen didn't bring me joy. It felt like war spoils, blood money. But it was also the ammunition I so desperately needed. I didn't waste a moment. I didn't search for large, well-known demolition firms. They would have too much corporate oversight, too many questions. I used the tablet Leo had smuggled to me and searched for smaller independent crews in the greater Boston area. I found a company called Sal's Demolition and Hauling. The website was simple, functional, with pictures of leveled commercial buildings and cleared lots. It had a phone number and a name. Sal Petrillo. I met him not at his office, but in a small, noisy coffee shop in Alston, far from the manicured lawns of Brookline. He was a man built like a bulldog, with thick hands, stained with what looked like a lifetime of grease and hard work. He had a weary but direct gaze. He looked at me, a frail-looking old woman in a simple coat, and his expression was one of polite skepticism. "Mrs. Sterling?" He asked, his voice a low rumble. "Mr. Petrillo, thank you for meeting me." We sat at a small table, the smell of burnt coffee and steamed milk thick in the air. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I slid a folder across the table. "What's this?" he grunted, opening it. Inside was a certified copy of the deed to the house, my name and Richard's clear as day, and a copy of his death certificate. Legally, the property was mine. Next to it, I placed the blueprints I'd received, both the original and Richard's altered version. "That's my house," I said simply. "I want it gone." He looked from the deed to me, his brow furrowed. "Gone? You mean you're renovating, gutting the interior?" "No." I said, my gaze as direct as his. "I mean, I want it leveled. I want the entire structure torn down, hauled away, and the lot cleared. All of it. Especially the foundation. I want the foundation dug up and broken apart. Completely." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. He wasn't looking at a grieving widow. He was a man who understood contracts and intentions. He was trying to read mine. "Ma'am, that's a big job. A family home like that in Brookline. People don't just tear them down. They're worth a fortune. My reasons are my own." I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "The question is, can your company handle the job?" He nodded slowly. "We can handle it, but it's expensive, and you need permits from the city. That can take weeks, sometimes longer." "I'm aware," I said. I pushed a second folder across the table. It contained a cashier's check for the full amount of the estimate he had given me over the phone, plus a generous bonus. "This is for you, in full, in cash, essentially. And this," I added, sliding a thick manila envelope over, "is a retainer for a legal expediter I've already hired. They will handle the permits. They've been instructed to inform you the moment they are approved." Sal stared at the cashier's check, then back at me. The skepticism in his eyes was replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated professionalism. I wasn't a crazy old woman anymore. I was a client, a serious one. "You want the whole thing paid up front?" He asked, a hint of awe in his voice. "I want it done," I corrected him. "I want to sign a contract today. The demolition date will be 1 month from now. Not a day sooner, not a day later. At 7 a.m. He picked up the check, feeling its weight, as if to confirm it was real. He looked at the blueprints again, tapping the spot where I had circled the area beneath the fireplace. "You really want us to go deep on that foundation, huh?" "I want nothing left," I said. He nodded, a slow, final understanding dawning on his face. He didn't need to know why. The money was his why. He pulled a standard contract from his briefcase and began to fill it out. I watched his thick, calloused fingers write the date, the address, the terms. My prison, my tomb. He was writing its death warrant. He pushed it across the table. "Sign here." I took the pen. My hand did not shake. The signature was firm, a stark contrast to the trembling, uncertain woman I had been just a few weeks prior. The contract was signed. The future was set in motion. And then began the longest month of my life. Living in the basement, knowing what was to come, was a surreal experience. The sounds from upstairs, Chloe's laughter, the murmur of the television. David's heavy footsteps sounded different. They were temporary. They were the noises of ghosts who didn't yet know they were dead. I marked the days on a small calendar Leo had brought me, crossing each one off with a firm black X. Each X was a nail in the coffin of my old life. Leo visited often, his presence, a quiet comfort in the gloom. He'd bring me books and food, and we'd talk in hushed tones. He never questioned my plan. He saw the new light in my eyes, the steel in my spine, and he simply trusted me. On the final night, the eve of the demolition, I did something they never would have expected. For weeks, my access to the upstairs had been limited, my presence in the kitchen treated as an intrusion. But that afternoon, I walked up the stairs from the basement, and I didn't stop at the hallway. I walked directly into the kitchen. Chloe was on the phone, leaning against the marble countertop, laughing about some friend's disastrous vacation. She saw me, and her face tightened. "Elizabeth, what do you need?" Her tone was that of a person addressing a troublesome servant. "I'm cooking dinner," I said, my voice even. She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Dinner we were going to order in." "Not tonight," I said, moving past her to the refrigerator. I began pulling out ingredients: a roasting chicken, potatoes, fresh rosemary, carrots and onions. "I'm making a family meal. For us. A final dinner in this house." She was too stunned to argue. She watched me for a moment, a mixture of suspicion and bewilderment on her face, before retreating to the living room to whisper furiously to David. I didn't care. I moved around the kitchen that had once been mine with a long-forgotten familiarity. The weight of the chef's knife in my hand was comforting. The scent of the rosemary crushed between my fingers was a balm. I was cooking all of David's childhood favorites: roast chicken with crispy skin, garlic mashed potatoes, honey-glazed carrots. The aromas filled the house, a stark contrast to the sterile, lifeless air that had permeated it since they'd arrived. It was the smell of a home, a final, fleeting illusion of one. When it was ready, I didn't set the casual kitchen table. I went to the formal dining room, the one reserved for holidays and Richard's business partners. I spread my best tablecloth, the one I hadn't used in a decade. I set out the good china and the silver. I lit candles. I went to the doorway of the living room. They were sitting on their new, brutally modern sofa, staring at their phones. "Dinner is served," I announced. They came, drawn by a combination of suspicion and the undeniable aroma of the food. They sat stiffly at the long, polished table, the candlelight flickering in their eyes. The meal began in a tense, heavy silence, broken only by the clinking of silverware against porcelain. Chloe picked at her food, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting a trap to spring. David, however, ate with a strange, almost wistful hunger. The taste of his childhood seemed to momentarily disarm him. I let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. Then I spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about your father," I said, my voice soft, conversational. David looked up, startled. Chloe sighed, a small, impatient sound. "This house," I continued, looking around the room, "is full of him. Not the man you remember. Not the successful architect, the respected member of the community. I've been living with the other man. The one who lived in the silences between words. I didn't look at them. I looked at my hands resting on the tablecloth. He was a cold man, David. So cold. Do you remember how you could never quite please him, how his approval was always just out of reach? That wasn't you. That was him. He built walls, not just out of brick and wood, but out of fear. His fear. And he made us all live inside them. It wasn't an attack. It was a confession. A quiet, painful admission of my own role in the family's dysfunction. I was a part of it. My silence was the mortar that held his walls together. I was afraid. Afraid of his moods, of his disapproval. Afraid of being alone. And so I said nothing. For 50 years I said nothing. I let the silence grow until it filled every room in this house until it was all I could hear. That was my weakness, and I'm sorry for it. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger for you. For the first time, a genuine emotion crossed David's face. Not anger, not greed. It was confusion, a deep, unsettling confusion, as if a foundational belief had been shaken. He looked at me, really looked at me perhaps for the first time since the funeral. He was seeing the ghost of a mother he never knew. Chloe, however, was immune. She glanced at the diamond-encrusted smartwatch on her wrist, her boredom palpable. "It's all in the past, Elizabeth," she said, her voice clipped and dismissive. "Richard is gone. The house is sold. It's time to let go of all this melodrama. Let's look to the future." I met her cold gaze across the flickering candlelight. A small, serene smile touched my lips. "You're right, Chloe," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, imbued with a finality that she was incapable of understanding. "You're absolutely right. The future starts tomorrow." I went to bed that night in my cold basement room, and for the first time in decades, I slept without dreaming. The sound that woke me wasn't a nightmare, but a doorbell. It rang at exactly 7 o'clock, a sharp, insistent chime that sliced through the morning quiet. Upstairs, I heard movement, a groggy curse from David, the irritated patter of Chloe's feet. I was already dressed. My small suitcase containing everything I truly valued stood by the basement door. I walked up the stairs, my heart beating a steady, powerful rhythm. I was waiting on the front porch when David wrenched the door open. He was wearing a pair of expensive silk pajamas, his hair a mess, his face a mask of fury. Chloe stood behind him, wrapped in a matching silk robe, her expression one of utter disbelief. "What in God's name is going on?" David sputtered, his eyes falling on the scene before him. It wasn't a nurse or an orderly from a nursing home. On the front walk stood Sal Petrillo and his crew of 5 men holding hard hats and tools. A massive yellow excavator was parked on the street, its engine rumbling, a mechanical beast ready to feast. A large flatbed truck with a wrecking ball crane was behind it, and standing calmly beside Sal were 2 Brookline police officers, their presence an undeniable statement of authority. "Who are you people?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill. "Get off our property." "Actually," I said, my voice ringing out in the cool morning air with a strength I hadn't felt in 50 years. "It's my property." David and Chloe spun around to face me. For a moment, they just stared, their brains unable to process the sight of me standing there, calm and in control, with my suitcase at my side. "Mother, what is the meaning of this?" David's voice was a mixture of confusion and rage. Did you call the police?" I didn't answer immediately. I savored the moment. I reached into my handbag and pulled out 2 documents. I handed one to David. It was a copy of the fully paid, legally binding demolition contract. The other I gave to Chloe. It was the official stamped city permit, authorizing the complete razing of the structure at 112 Harrington Lane. "This is my house, David," I said, my voice clear and unwavering. I looked from his face to Chloe's, watching the understanding dawn in their eyes like a slow, horrifying sunrise. "And I've decided to remodel." The color drained from David's face. He looked from the contract to the excavator, then back to me. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Chloe's carefully constructed mask of bored superiority shattered into a million pieces. Her face contorted with a raw, ugly fury. "You can't do this," she shrieked. "We have a settlement. We have an agreement. You have an agreement to purchase a property that as of this morning is slated for demolition," I said calmly. "A material fact I believe your lawyer will find quite interesting. Now I suggest you collect your personal belongings. You have about 5 minutes before Sal and his men begin their work. This is insane. David finally found his voice a desperate cracking sound. You're insane. We'll sue you. We'll have you declared incompetent. One of the police officers stepped forward, his expression impassive. Sir, we're not here to mediate a domestic dispute. We're here to prevent a breach of the peace during a legal property action. The owner of record has a valid permit to demolish her property. You are now trespassing. Please leave the premises. The look of dawning horror on their faces was more satisfying than 1,000 courtroom victories. Their world, built on deceit and entitlement, was literally about to be torn down around them. The police escorted them, protesting and threatening off the property. They had nothing but their silk pajamas and their sputtering rage. The neighbours were starting to emerge from their houses, drawn by the commotion, their phones already out recording. The perfectly curated image of the grieving, supportive family was imploding in real time. I didn't leave. I didn't drive away in a taxi to start my new life. Not yet. I crossed the street to the small park opposite the house. Leo was there waiting for me with 2 folding lawn chairs. He had a thermos of tea. He hugged me tightly, and then we sat down side by side. He took my hand, his grip warm and steady, and we watched. The wrecking ball swung first. The sound of it hitting the brick facade was a deafening crack, a sound of rupture, of liberation. A cloud of red dust billowed into the air. The wall of my bedroom, the window I had stared out of for 50 years, crumbled and fell away. David and Chloe were across the street now, screaming, crying, threatening lawsuits to anyone who would listen. Chloe was on her phone, her voice hysterical, no doubt trying to salvage some piece of their collapsing social standing. But no one was listening. All eyes were on the house. It was a loud, violent, beautiful symphony of destruction. The walls of my prison, the monument to Richard's quiet evil, came crashing down. The roof sagged and then collapsed inward with a great groan. Each crash, each shattering of glass, was a note in my song of freedom. I watched it all, my expression serene, the tea warming my hands. This wasn't just about a house. It was an exorcism, but the climax wasn't the house falling. The true finale came after the structure was a pile of splintered wood and broken brick. It came when the excavator moved in. Sal, true to his word, and my contract, directed the operator to the foundation. The machine's massive steel bucket bit into the earth, tearing up the concrete slab where the living room had once been. It clawed at the ground beneath the old fireplace, digging deeper and deeper. And then it happened. A loud metallic clang echoed across the site. The excavator's bucket had struck something unyielding. The work stopped. The operator leaned out of his cab, shouting to Sal. The police officers who had remained on site suddenly became very alert. This was the moment I had prepared them for. An hour earlier, using my burner phone, I had made an anonymous call to the Brookline PD tip line. I'd told them I was a local historian who believed there might be an object of potential archaeological significance buried in the foundation of the old Sterling house, a rumor I'd heard about a custom-built vault from the time of its construction. Now they had their probable cause. They waved Sal's crew back and moved in, trading their roles as peacekeepers for that of investigators. They directed the excavator operator to dig carefully around the object. Slowly, painstakingly, the dirt was cleared away. And there it was. Dull grey lead, unmistakable in the morning sun. The top of a sealed, reinforced chamber. Richard's hidden tomb. The officers brought in specialized tools. As they worked to pry open the lid, a silence fell over the entire street. Even David and Chloe stopped their hysterics, watching in stunned fascination. The lid came loose with a final groaning screech of metal. The officers peered inside. One of them immediately turned away, his face pale, and spoke urgently into his radio. From my chair across the street, I couldn't see the contents. But I didn't need to. I knew what they had found. The news crews who had arrived to cover the bizarre story of a wealthy family being evicted by their matriarch now had the story of a lifetime. The cameras zoomed in. Inside the lead-lined vault lay the skeletal remains of a young woman. The bones were tangled with the remnants of a decayed dress. And there, resting against the delicate bones of her neck, still catching the light after all these years, was a small, tarnished silver locket. Richard's final, most monstrous secret was now public record, unearthed for the entire world to see. I took a slow sip of my tea. The ground was broken, and I was free. The first thing I remember isn't the sight, but the sound. A collective, guttural gasp from the crowd that had gathered. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated horror, a single human noise made by 100 mouths. It ripped through the mechanical groan of the excavator, silencing everything. Then a new sound began. The frantic, almost hysterical clicking of cameras. It was like a swarm of metallic insects descending. Leo's hand found mine, his grip tight, grounding me. We sat in his car parked across the street, the windows rolled up, but the sounds still bled through. The police tape, a flimsy yellow barrier, seemed laughably inadequate for the abyss that had just been opened. The story didn't just break, it detonated. It was a national headline by noon, an international one by nightfall. The monster of Brookline, they called Richard. The House of Horrors. My husband's face, the one I had woken up next to for 50 years, was suddenly a mugshot, a symbol of suburban evil. His carefully constructed legacy of civic leadership and architectural brilliance was vaporized in an instant. All that was left was the monstrous truth he had buried in our foundation. The media frenzy was a ravenous beast. News vans lined the street for a week, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky like skeletal fingers. Reporters, young and hungry, trampled the remains of Chloe's prize-winning roses, shouting questions at anyone who came near. They turned our lives, our neighbors' lives, into a ghoulish spectacle. I watched it all from the sterile anonymity of a hotel room miles away, Leo by my side, fielding calls and shielding me from the worst of it. The television was a constant flickering portal into the wreckage of our world, and at the center of that wreckage were David and Chloe. Their downfall was not a quiet collapse, it was a public execution. The first images of them were of two people in expensive pajamas, their faces masks of disbelief and rage being herded away by police. Those photos went viral. The internet, a world I barely understood, became their judge, jury, and executioner. Chloe's carefully curated online life became an exhibit for the prosecution. Her Instagram, once a testament to her supposed good taste and family values, was now a digital monument to her hypocrisy. Every post with the hashtag #ChurchFamilyFirst was flooded with thousands of comments, vicious and cruel. Family first? You threw his mother in a dungeon. Did you post this from the crime scene? Memes were made. David's bewildered face, Chloe's sneer of indignation. They became caricatures of greed. Their friends, the ones who had sipped wine in my living room, vanished. Their calls went unanswered. Invitations were rescinded. They were social lepers tainted by the sins of the father and their own spectacular avarice. David's professional life disintegrated. The prestigious law firm where he was a partner issued a curt statement announcing he was on an indefinite leave of absence. We all knew what that meant. His clients' pillars of the Boston community could not afford to be associated with the son of a serial killer. He was disbarred from clubs his father had helped found. The legacy he had been so desperate to inherit, the name he had wielded like a weapon, was now an anchor, dragging him to the bottom. I saw them on the news one afternoon, leaving a police station after hours of questioning. They looked haggard, aged a decade in a matter of days. Chloe hid her face behind a designer handbag, a pathetic shield against the barrage of cameras. David, my son, just stared ahead, his eyes hollow. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man whose world had been built on a lie, and the lie had just swallowed him whole. A part of me, a deeply buried maternal part, felt a flicker of pity. It was a weak, dying ember, and I quickly smothered it. Pity was a luxury I had never been afforded. It was a currency they had never dealt in, their legal troubles compounded. The district attorney's office opened an investigation not just into Richard's crimes, but into David and Chloe's finances. My own elder abuse claim, once a private threat, was now a matter of public record. Investigators looked into the swift transfer of assets, the pressure they had put on me, the attempt to have me declared incompetent. They were being consumed by the very fire they had tried to use to forge their new lives. They lost everything: their reputation, their friends, their careers. Soon they would lose their own home, swallowed by legal fees. They became pariahs, ghosts, haunting the ruins of a disgraced name. Their punishment was to live out the very future they had planned for me, isolated, powerless, and penniless. While their world imploded, the world of Richard's victims began to open up. The skeleton in the vault was identified within 48 hours. The small, tarnished silver locket was the key. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, a 20-year-old art student at Boston College who had vanished in the spring of 1983, the same year the final concrete for the foundation was poured. Her family, an elderly mother in Florida and a brother in Oregon, had never given up hope. They saw her locket on the national news. For them, 40 years of agonizing uncertainty had finally come to an end, replaced by a devastating certainty. And then others came forward. The story of the lead-lined box and its grotesque trophies was published. An elderly man from New Hampshire called the tip line. My sister Maria, she disappeared in 1991. She wore a single pearl earring just like the one you described. It was a gift from our grandmother. A woman from California emailed a grainy photo to the investigators. This is my mother, Eleanor. She went missing in 1978. That lock of blonde hair. It looks just like hers. She was a waitress at a diner Richard used to frequent. The Polaroid photos, once just terrifying images, were now clues. Facial recognition technology, something that sounded like science fiction to me, was used to try and identify the terrified young women in the pictures. The investigation ballooned. Richard wasn't just a man who had killed once. He was a predator who had hunted for decades using his charm, his power, and the cover of his perfect life to lure and destroy. The house had been his mausoleum. My prison had been his trophy room. My own role in this was scrutinized, of course. I gave my statement to a pair of detectives, a man and a woman, who looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional curiosity. I told them everything. The years of Richard's control, his coldness, his sudden rages, the way he made me feel small, insignificant, the way he isolated me from my friends and family until he was my entire world. And I told them about my silence. The question hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. How could you live in that house for 50 years and not know? It was a question I had asked myself 1,000 times in the dark of the basement. The media asked it too. Some commentators painted me as a long-suffering wife, a victim in my own right. Others were less kind. They hinted at complicity, at a willful blindness that bordered on criminal. She must have known. One talking head declared, his face smug with certainty. A woman knows her husband. Did I knew the man who paid the bills, who chose my clothes, who corrected my grammar at dinner parties. I knew the man who could silence me with a look. But the man who dug graves in his own foundation. The man who collected pieces of the lives he'd stolen. I did not know him. Or perhaps more accurately, I had refused to see him. Fear is a powerful blinder. Over decades, it can calcify into a kind of ignorance, a survival mechanism. Admitting what he was would have meant admitting my life was a lie, that my marriage was a cage built on top of a tomb. It was a truth too terrible to face, until I had nothing left to lose. But for every voice that condemned me, there were others that reached out in support. I received letters, hundreds of them. They came from women who understood. I was married to a man like that for 30 years. One letter began, "Thank you for showing me it's never too late to be free." Another woman wrote, "You are not to blame. They make us small, so we can't see the size of their evil." These messages from strangers I would never meet were a balm on a wound I didn't even know was still bleeding. They saw me not as a monster's wife, but as a fellow survivor. Leo was my rock. He was the one who read those letters to me, his voice steady, even when mine would have broken. He created a new private email address for me and handled everything. He was my firewall, my translator for this new, frightening world. In his eyes, I was never a fool or an accomplice. I was just his grandmother, a woman who had finally fought back. He had lost his parents in a way. He saw them for what they were, and while it pained him, he never wavered in his loyalty to me. We were a strange, fractured family of two, adrift on the wreckage of the past. A few months passed. The seasons began to turn. The news cycle moved on to other horrors, other tragedies. The lot on our old street in Brookline became just a place, no longer a spectacle. The police finished their excavation. The hole had been filled in with fresh soil, but it was still a scar on the manicured landscape of the neighborhood. One cool autumn afternoon, before we left for good, I asked Leo to drive me there one last time. We didn't get out of the car. We just sat, looking at the empty space where my life had happened. The great old oak tree still stood in the corner of the property, its leaves turning a brilliant, fiery red. It was strange. I had expected to feel a profound sense of loss, a gaping void where my home used to be. I had lived there for half a century. I had raised my son there. I had endured my life there. But looking at that patch of empty earth, I felt nothing of the sort. I felt light. The house had been a weight, a beautiful, oppressive weight of stone and secrets. Richard's secrets, my secrets, the secrets of the women he had buried there. It was a monument to pain, and I had torn it down. I hadn't just escaped it. I had annihilated it. In its destruction, I hadn't lost a home. I had reclaimed my life. I took the house with me. I whispered more to myself than to Leo. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. I smiled, a real smile. It doesn't exist anymore. Its power is gone. I took it, and I threw it away. He seemed to understand. He put the car in drive, and we drove away from Brookline without looking back. We used what was left of my money, the money that had been rightfully mine all along, to start over. We went as far away as we could, chasing the sun. We found a small 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet town on the California coast. It wasn't grand. It didn't have a history. The walls were thin, and the furniture was from a discount store. But it was ours. The living room had a large glass door that opened onto a tiny balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Every morning, I would make a cup of tea and sit out there watching the waves roll in. The sea was so vast, so endless. It was the perfect antidote to the memory of the basement. The salt air felt clean, washing away the lingering scent of damp earth and decay. I was no longer a prisoner in a basement. I was no longer the silent, dutiful wife of Richard March. I was no longer a mother, grieving the son I had lost long before he was ruined. I was just Elizabeth, a woman of 78, with a grandson she adored and a view of the ocean. My family was gone, save for Leo. My fortune was a fraction of what it once was. My name was forever tied to a story of darkness and death. But standing on that balcony with the sun on my face and the sound of the ocean in my ears, I felt a sensation that was so foreign it took me a moment to name it. Freedom. For the first time in my entire adult life, I was truly, completely free. The past was a hole in the ground, a continent away. The future was the endless blue horizon. Secrets are heavy. They're like foundations buried deep, holding up a life that isn't real. We all have them in one form or another. The question is, what are we willing to do to unearth the truth? Some truths are best left buried, but others are so toxic, they poison the very ground we stand on. They have to be dug up, no matter the cost. Sometimes the only way to build a new life is to demolish the old one right down to the foundation. Think about the walls around you, the life you've built. Is it a fortress or is it a prison? If you've ever felt trapped by a secret, either yours or someone else's, share your story in the comments below. Let us know what freedom means to you. Because as I've learned, it's never ever too late to find it.